All right. Well, thank you all so much for being here. Welcome to one of our webinars in honoring June as PTSD Awareness Month, among many other things, which we'll get to later. Thank you so much again for being here. Thank you for introducing yourselves in the chat and filling out some of the poll questions. We'll read through some of those in a moment here. We'll give folks a few more minutes to fill that out. But in the meantime, my name is Brennison Wheeler. I use she, her, and her pronouns, and I am the Education and Outreach Coordinator at Women's Advocates, which is a nonprofit organization located in St. Paul, Minnesota, that offers a continuum of safety through our prevention programming, emergency shelter, and aftercare housing support services for victims of domestic violence. Just a quick few reminders and announcements. We will be sending up a follow-up email with a link to the recording of the webinar and a PDF of the PowerPoint slides, as well as information on how to receive a certificate of attendance. You'll need to request that via email. And then again, this is a webinar, so none of the attendees can be heard or seen, so no worries about that. Excuse me. And then I wanted to also acknowledge and extend gratitude for our American Sign Language or ASL interpretation services, which are provided by ThinkSelf Minnesota's Deaf Education and Advocacy's Specialized Interpreting Fellowship Training Program, or SIFT. And I am so excited to have two wonderful presenters here with us from the Mind Body Trauma Care Lab over in Duluth, Minnesota, Kelsey and Vianne. If you want to go to the next slide, Vianne. Great, so these are our two presenters and I will be acting as a moderator. So please feel free to send questions in the chat or the Q&A. We'd love to hear from you. With any questions that you have, anything that you'd like to share throughout the presentation, that is always welcome. And I'll allow Vianne and Kelsey to kind of share some more things about themselves in a moment here, but I'll go ahead and end the poll here so you can kind of see who is here. So the first question was kind of about the sector that best describes your role in the community or why you chose to attend the webinar. And 53% of us reported that we are victim service providers. And then 18% said that they are victim survivors of domestic or sexual violence. And then another 18% identified as a mental health professional. And then in terms of what best fits our current mood, 55% said sweet. And then 14% said salty and another 14% said umami. So that's fun. I would say that mine kind of falls under sweet as well. And then as far as familiarity with mind-body practices, 57% reported that they are familiar and have tried mind-body practices before in the past. And then 34% said that they're not really familiar and they've never tried mind-body practices themselves. So thank you all so much for sharing that information about yourselves. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing and pass it over to Vianne.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. It's nice to see where people are coming from in the chat. It seems like we have people from four corners of the US, I guess, depending on which corners you pick. We've got Minnesota, and then North Carolina, Texas, Oregon. So keep sharing and introducing yourselves in the chat. Oh, Jamaica, New York. And then of course, so Brennison is moderating, so she'll keep an eye on the chat. So you're definitely welcome to ask questions throughout. And Kelsey and I will try to keep an eye on it too. So just to briefly introduce myself before moving on to the next part, as Brennison said, I'm Vianne. I'm an assistant professor over in the Department of Psychology on the Duluth campus of the University of Minnesota, and I direct the Mind Body Trauma Care Lab. So I'll pass it on to Kelsey.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kelsey. I'm zooming to you from Bowling Green, Ohio, but I will soon be moving to Duluth in August to start graduate school and working with Vianne and the Mind Body Trauma Care Lab. I am a 200-hour registered yoga teacher and also a trauma center, trauma-sensitive yoga facilitator. And I'm really excited to be able to share a practice with you all at the end of this presentation.
Thanks, Kelsey. I do want to emphasize a little bit about Kelsey's TCTSY facilitator certification. So there are many trauma-informed yoga certifications, and TCTSYF is one of the most time-intensive ones. So it's really an honor and privilege for, I think, for Kelsey to be here, and she'll be joining the lab as our designated person with that specific certification. Okay. So as we move forward, these are the 3 objectives that we have in mind for the presentation. They were the ones that were listed as well when you signed up for the webinar. So essentially, the first one is to increase knowledge of theories on trauma and embodiment. 2 is to apply various interventions that promote mind-body connection for trauma survivors, in the sense that we want to build on these theories and then see what is it that you all can take away and apply in your own lives or to the lives of those you serve. And the third objective is to have a broader understanding of the expansive research in this field. And that's really just going to be integrated throughout, knowing that everything we talk about is evidence-based. So it's a lot of inner wisdom that has been translated to meet whatever the scientific community has deemed necessary for it to be considered evidence-based treatment or empirically based interventions. So the roadmap that we have for the next 90 minutes will provide just a broad overview of, I guess, the lab, essentially, and then really dive into some theories on trauma and embodiment. Then 2, go over like 5 mini interventions that hopefully you can take with you today. And then 3, Kelsey is going to guide us in an invitation for a chair practice. And then we'll leave time for questions and answers at the end. And knowing, of course, that you're definitely welcome to ask questions throughout. So Brennison is moderating the chat, and yeah, we're happy to take questions at any point during the first 2 sections. Okay, so a little bit about mind-body trauma care. So it's this idea that trauma lives within our bodies, that we embody it. And we have to consider both mind and body when approaching trauma treatment and mental and physical health, and most things, I would say, in life, or all the things. So essentially, the mission of the Mind-Body Trauma Care Lab is to increase access to holistic and trauma-informed mental health care. And we do that in 2 main ways. So one is bringing these interventions out to individuals who might not otherwise access them, whether that's through technology or community-based engagement. So in that way, because sometimes these concepts seem not accessible to people, or they haven't tried it. So like in the poll that we broadcast earlier, I think about a third hadn't tried any sort of mind-body intervention. And it can seem like this kind of elusive thing that's like, what is this? It seems like hippie or like foreign or far away. So that's one way in which we try to increase access to care with that. And then having trauma-informed mental health care encompass both mind and body. Okay, so with that, now we'll move on to the big meat of this, talking about theories on trauma and embodiment. So this really lays the groundwork as to why the interventions are effective, why they work, and what we're really building on. So the foundation of the idea of embodied healing. So let's start with a little exercise if you feel like participating. So, living in Minnesota, it's very easy for me to imagine it being cold. Like, 2 weekends ago, it was in the 80s, 90s, record breaking for here. And then the weekend after, we had like this cold spell, and it was in the 50s, which is definitely not as cold as it gets in Minnesota. I just want to clarify that. But just to have in 7 days, it to go like 30 something or 40 degrees, it can feel a little cold and chilly and windy. So And I imagine wherever you are, there's some sort of temperature range in which it feels a little bit cold. So just imagine yourself there. And so my mom lives in Clearwater, Florida, and my brother is in Honolulu, and it'll be 70 degrees and they're wearing a sweatshirt. So wherever you are, whatever cold means to you, imagine yourself like walking outside and feeling that initial rush. So maybe you notice kind of like the person in this photograph, maybe your shoulders are hunched up a little bit and you're trying to maintain your warmth by huddling and keeping things tight. Just, yeah, I guess I can't see you all, but whatever it feels like to you might look very similar. The tissue is optional, but whatever you feel like. And just, oh, we have a Clearwater person. They're close to my mom. So just imagining yourself holding this for a period of time. Just staying in this. And in a way, that'll become this like baseline contraction for us. And this act of holding this really tight, uptight posture is kind of like what the last year and a half has been, and really like a lifetimes, if you consider the idea of oppressive traumas and systems of repression that innately impact all of us, whether or not we can address it or pinpoint it at all. I think in the past year and a half, it has come forward in the forefront of all this in terms of people naming the isms that exist, seeing COVID as a traumatic stressor. And there have just been so many other things that are going on in terms of politics, all the isms, social justice, and just feeling lonely from the quarantine and everything else that's been going on in the world. So in a way, we've all been experiencing the sense of walking outside and just feeling the bitter coldness, the chill, and that's been our sense of embodied trauma, embodied stress over the last year and a half. And you can imagine how various forms of trauma can really stay in our bodies. So imagine like somebody having experienced childhood trauma, like that sense of tension is just carried with them, and it's hard to know anything different. So from this, when we think of these system level traumas, it weighs on us, on our bodies. It's like carrying the weight of the world, carrying the weight of all these systems. So even when it feels as though people might not have had experienced like a big T, a big trauma, there are just stressors and many traumas, little t traumas that are inherent within living in this world, within this society. So you can imagine like all these layers of oppression weighing on us. So as an individual, there's societal structural oppression to institutional, to interpersonal, just microaggressions and things that we might not even be able to consciously name. But all of this is weighing on us. This is our trauma, our collective trauma. And although it might not be what we initially think as trauma, it is in terms of how our body is recognizing it. So it begs the question of what is trauma? What is stress? What is trauma? And before we dive into that piece, I just want to acknowledge that there are groups who have been marginalized and oppressed. And during this month of June, there are many to honor and celebrate. And in this month, there are some specific groups to celebrate this month, this week, this day. And I just want to take note of that. As I had mentioned, the trauma of oppression can be understated and not viewed. And being a part of a group who has experienced a history of oppression is in a way is stressful and can be traumatic in and of itself. So I want to acknowledge that today is the 101st anniversary of of Clayton Jackson Mickey's lynching in Duluth, the city that I am in now, which has been regarded by many as one of the worst lynchings in the nation. So that was June 15th, 1920. And then this upcoming Saturday is Juneteenth. And there were so many other months of this month that I wasn't aware of until I looked it up. So I'm wondering, is there anything else that you all would like to acknowledge? Anything else this month, day, week? Any other groups that you feel as though that you want to honor in this space as one that might be underserved and experiences trauma from like a systemic lens? Oh, today is Elder Abuse Awareness Day. Thank you for sharing that. Did not know that. Yes. LGBTQIA+. They didn't have the IA on there. Well, thanks all. There's a growing list, I imagine, and thank you all for taking the time to honor and broaden our understanding of trauma. Because the thing about trauma, I guess, so we must enter a lens that there's a universal assumption of trauma. No, we don't really want to make assumptions. This is, on one hand, a safer assumption in which it's for the betterment of others. So regardless of being in any of the aforementioned groups, there's still an assumption of collective trauma. So this was just stated by Dr. Lisa Callahan just last month at a conference I was at. If only she knew I was. This is the second time I've quoted her in something. But I really like this idea, going into spaces and having that universal assumption, because we don't really quite know how to define trauma. So trauma, a lot of the times, the things that are defined really do come from a systems level. So the way something is considered a traumatic event in the US in terms of mental health practitioners, and I know a number of you are mental health practitioners, so please, you're welcome to share in the chat your experiences of this. It's defined by criterion A, the very first criterion within PTSD. So the DSM-5, which is kind of like the manual for diagnosing in the US, a lot of insurance companies rely on a DSM-5 diagnosis in order to reimburse. So following that, we only have, you need to have had an experience that meets the definition of a traumatic event per the DSM-5. And I think that limits us in so many ways, considering all the different ways in which stress and trauma is experienced within a person, between people, how it's defined. So this slide kind of looks like a big cluster of different words. And that's just really to show how stress and trauma can be defined in so many different ways. So according to DSM-5's criterion A of the traumatic event, you can see that in the yellow box on top. So that's exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. And then you can see how what we just talked about, that collective trauma, the systems of repression, microaggressions, racism, discrimination, all of that oftentimes does not fit into this category, right? And then so we have these concepts of various forms of trauma, big T and little t trauma, they can be called. Big T trauma as being like big singular events, and little t trauma as being ongoing events that can happen. And research is really emerging on how little t traumas can be as or even more impactful than big T traumas. So little t traumas, in terms of something that's pervasive and ongoing, and something that's also in the mind-body trauma care lab research interests, would be like emotional abuse. So you can see how emotional abuse may not meet the DSM-5 criterion A. Yet if it's something so pervasive and ongoing and it impacts one's view of oneself, then you can see how that relates to all the other criteria within PTSD. So I want to point out that sometimes there are phrases that are used that aren't PTSD because they don't meet that diagnostic criteria. Yet, in terms of criterion A and how that trauma is defined, but people can have so many other symptoms. So you might refer to as post-traumatic stress symptoms, otherwise known as PTSS, post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms, and traumatic stress. So I'm seeing something from Stephanie. Yeah. So trauma is what happened inside you as a result of what happens to you. That's a really, great quote, and really points to how trauma is what one defines as trauma is individual. And it's how that person processes it. And I don't know how to pronounce Gabermati, but I do want to note that there's a movie series that's going on that Gabermati is hosting that's free to stream online this week. So just FYI, it started last week and it's ongoing. So something to look up. And then, so we see from that the ICD-11, which is like the DSM-5, but internationally, so international classification of diseases and disorders, that like the European Union uses. For them, they don't define trauma. So that is up to the person. So it's something that it may develop following exposure to extremely threatening or horrific event or series of events. So in that way, it leaves it open to that person. So like what Stephanie is saying in terms of adjusting that trauma definition to something more individual, that speaks to that. So you'll have a copy of the slides if you want to look at these definitions or terms more in depth. The overall takeaway is that trauma can be all types of things to all different people. And I even wonder in this space, what types of traumas would you add to this? So you see on the upper left-hand corner, I added like betrayal trauma, historical trauma, racial trauma, transgenerational trauma. But what else would you add to this list? Yeah. The idea of PTSD in the womb, definitely, for sure. Yeah, the trauma center, like we're looking at more the prenatal effects of trauma in the womb and how to like intersect that during the pregnancy stage. Religious trauma, sexual trauma, spiritual trauma. Yeah. Not having basic needs met, the lack of nutritious foods and hunger. Neglect. Yeah, that's also a really big thing in which it doesn't necessarily fall under criterion A definition of trauma. Yeah, it is traumatic, oftentimes re-victimization, so that compounding trauma, refugee war trauma. So knowing that these areas can overlap and they're also distinct too, because like as Sarah said, refugee war trauma, there's likely going to be a transgenerational aspect of that. Bullying, peer pressure, so trauma from peers as well. So knowing that it impacts people across age groups, and yeah, peers can be just as distressing as someone else. Like the idea of sticks and stones break my bones, but words may never hurt me, like that playground chant. Depending on where you're from, it's an idiom for like if someone's not beating you up physically, then you should be able to shrug off what they say. Cultural trauma, oppression, ancestral trauma, homelessness and all the circumstances. Yeah. So knowing it really is like all these intersecting traumas and all these contexts that go behind different aspects. So thanks all for sharing. I feel like this slide could just like really be a lot. Yeah. Helping systems, yes. And sometimes I think with that, it's like a hierarchy of helping too, instead of being of service and walking alongside. So with that, knowing that as we kind of practice at the beginning, all of this, especially considering that you can't just put a sentence in terms of what trauma is for everybody. As y'all shared in the chat, as the other slide showed, there's a lot of ways of defining trauma. And trauma is stored in our bodies because they can be like transgenerational. They can be, somebody can be born with trauma in their body from either perinatal trauma or what's passed down from pregnancy. So in order to heal trauma, we cannot ignore the body. So although there's a lot of research on talk therapy with missing the body component might not be as helpful for people with complex PTSD or traumas that are really stored in their body in the long term. To access that, we really need to be body first, body based, body focused. Because it all starts in our brain, right? So this is called the triune brain, basically proposed by MacLean in the 80s, in the sense that our brain has 3 areas. So we know there are different quadrants and whatnot. But in terms of this is I think a approachable way of thinking about it. So in the back of our brain, we have what's called the reptilian brain. And that is really body based. So as like reptiles, they have this part of the brain. So it's like our instinct of what to do, to fight or freeze. And then moving forward, we have the emotional brain called the mammalian brain, which also relates to like how you can see mammals can display a sense of emotion, attachment, thinking of monkeys and dogs and how they can show that emotional state. And then we have the neocortex, or the cognitive executive functioning part of the brain, which is in a way uniquely human and something that differentiates us from reptiles. So that connection between our reptilian brain and our neocortex can be disrupted though through trauma, through, I'm seeing like epigenetics and people. So whether that's from birth carried forward or as we're developing as humans, keeping in mind, like our brains don't fully develop until we're 25. So with body-based healing, we can restore that connection between our reptilian brain and our neocortex. So essentially what happens is that our body, our instinct, our drives, it picks up on the reptilian brain reacts. It doesn't respond. So that space between a stimulus and a response, it doesn't quite have that space. It reacts instead of taking that pause and responding to something. So this can look like lashing out to somebody. It can look like having fear of something that might be perceived as safe. And so without that neocortex connection, then we aren't able to look at that objective event or state and label it as something that is safe. So through body-based work, through that sensory motor piece, then we can restore that connection. So sensory motor meaning like getting in touch with our senses and those motor movements. So then we can promote information processing from there and building those neural pathways. Okay, so with that, a lot of traditional talk therapies are top-down approaches, as they call it. So starting with our cognition and then moving to our emotion, so that neocortex mammalian aspect, and then looking at these body awareness aspects, your 5 senses. So that's kind of in a way external from us. And then movement, which is a balance of external, internal. Well, bottom 3 really are. And then bodily sensations, which is really checking in terms of what's going on in your body. So traditional talk therapies start at the cognition part, but how can it restore that connection with your reptilian brain if it doesn't get down there? So another approach is the bottom-up approach. So you're starting with your bodily sensations, and then you're working up towards your cognition. So, because sometimes it can be really, really hard to name traumas, to retell the story of traumas. I'm sure as you all have experience in work and life. So in a way, reconnecting with our bodily sensations or recognize what's going on in our bodies can be such a key foundational aspect in healing. Yet I want to acknowledge that there's a time for everything. Both can be helpful, that top-down approach, that bottom-up approach, because sometimes people aren't ready to access what's going on in their bodies, and staying at that cognitive kind of like surface level approach can be helpful for them. So, and sometimes like mindfulness can be viewed sometimes as something that's a little bit more cognitive than bodily sensations. So like if you're being mindful, like focusing on something and not being internally mindful what's going on in your body in a way that allows that practice to be more cognitive. And because the person might not have the resourcing in order to enter their bodies, because bodies can feel like a scary place because the body was there during trauma time. So it's a question of like where your body is now. Is it in the present? Is it living in trauma time? So knowing that there's a time and place for everything, both are helpful depending on time, person, place. Today we're going to start with the bottom-up approach because I guess because that's the purpose of today. but you can find a lot on top-down approaches, which I won't go into today. And Kelsey is going to lead us through a bottom-up approach too. Okay. And yeah, so I'm seeing in the chat, yeah, sometimes saying things aloud just feels trivial. And yeah, so it can really be not helpful in that sense, especially when people are asking you a lot of questions about something. It's like, I just want to like internally process this instead of coming up with words to say what happened. So yeah, and really trusting your inner wisdom too, without necessarily having to say it for that sense of validation. I mean, if it works, there's a time, place, person for everything. So reconnecting with going back to some neural stuff. So this is what's called the window of tolerance, which maybe some of you have heard about in sensory motor therapy, or DBT, dialectical behavior therapy. So essentially, we all have some sort of window of tolerance. So within that window, when we are feeling optimally aroused, we are at the state in which we might feel calm or alert. So it doesn't mean that we're just like, I guess, calm and serene all the time, but we're at this like stable middle ground of arousal. And there are times in which we might feel hyper aroused. So that's kind of like when we feel an urge to fight, thinking of that fight, flight, freeze, and fawn response. Whereas hypoarousal would be more the freezing, fawning aspect. So what we want is to try to expand that window of tolerance, because that will allow us to feel more grounded throughout time. Because as trauma shrinks that window, And our hope is to expand it. And to expand it, that requires awareness of when we're approaching, when we're getting out of our window. So the fawning aspect can kind of feel like, so it's not quite, so one, it was originally fight or flight, and then freeze came about in the sense in which you kind of, I guess, numb out. So that is also in a way a newer one. And fawn is kind of compliance in that sense. So it's not quite freezing, in which it's just like, all right. Whereas fawn is more like going into it, but not wanting to in that sense. And if anyone can explain it better, please do, because I'm not oh, yeah. Or Psychology Today. So yes. So what therapy does is that it acts on, oh yeah, people pleasing, compliance. I'm like searching for synonyms here. So, so therapy acts on high arousal and low arousal. So it's not hypoarousal or hyper arousal. It's acting on those edges, those regulatory boundaries between optimum and hyper or hypoarousal, because we want to challenge ourselves a little bit. So this idea of like increasing our comfort zone, that's really where the work is. As we approach those edges, being able to regulate our bodies in them, then we can slowly expand. So that's a concept to keep in mind as we move forward and talk about interventions. So overall, we are trying to approach trauma treatment from the outside in. So getting a sense of where you are and going inward instead of just focusing on the outside aspect. So in terms of that, looking at what's going inward inside of us, there are a few terms that are really like key in the literature. So with this idea of seption, so seption means nested inside ourselves, layers, like all those layers of oppression, the aspects that are weighing on ourselves. These are like our internal layers, like as you move in, what's going on. So neuroception is really important in the body-based literature because that is our subconscious, our like how our brain scans the area for safety without us even really knowing it. It determines those safety cues and then it responds. And this is connected to polyvagal theory, which is really like this foundational aspect of what body-based treatments act on. So it's so we are literally changing our neurons here and our pathways. And interestingly enough, I can't remember what kind of scientist he is. It might be a neuroscientist. Not exactly sure, but there was something. I feel like it was like it's like integrative neuroscientist, an emerging field. Did not actually create this theory for trauma. It was just what he found in the data. And then it just really connected with trauma therapists, rightfully so, as you can understand. So it can allow space and validation because we know our response. It's a response in which it's more of a reaction to what our brain is processing and labeling as safe or not. And then the very key word for like trauma sensitive yoga and a lot of these body-based treatments is interoception. So that is a super key word in this as well. So versus exteroception, which is when we might direct our attention outside of us. So interoception is this sense of, so these are the 4 subsystems of sensation. So kinesthesia, proprioception, vestibular, and visceral. So interoception is this way of being inside of our body notice, whether that's noticing things consciously or subconsciously, like our heartbeat, how full we are. We can tell if we're hungry, if we want to eat those tacos that you all mentioned, or a banana strawberry smoothie. It's our emotions, so that bottom up aspects. And within those sensation channels, we have 4 subsystems. So kinesthesia, which signals our muscle tension, relay signals. It's like those excess nerve impulses when we're feeling uptight. And proprioception, that's basically like where we are in space, our velocity, our sensation, our coordination, all the positional information about our joints. Then vestibular relates to like our changes in velocity, our balance. And then visceral is the deepest sense of bodily sensation that you can have, relating to your internal organs, your blood vessels, that gut instinct, which is so true, right? We have gut responses, and it's not as though it's something that starts cognitively that we can just name and label. It's a feeling in our gut, and that is a visceral sensation. So you can see how body-based approaches can interact or intercept these 4 different subsystems within our sensation channels. And that is really getting at the heart of trauma treatment, and heart, pun intended in that sense. And then that is changing literally our neurons and our connections in our brain. So where does pain fall? I'm seeing that question. So I would say it's, in a way, kinesthesia in terms of that sense of uptightness. So that's what I would say, but maybe it depends on the kind of pain. But I would say that in terms of like muscular, like feeling that tension, at least for me, when I feel tension, I would describe that as pain in that sense. Yeah, for bodily tension. So then, in summary, again, to repeat, trauma is stored in the body, and to heal trauma, we cannot ignore the body. Are there any other questions before we dive into some interventions? Let's give a little time in case people are typing. Okay. Well, you're welcome to ask questions in the chat anytime as we're going over the different interventions. All right. So now getting into, oh yes, Brennan will send out copies of the slides. Got that question down, yes. Okay. Yeah. So some mini interventions in which we're focusing on tending to our body and mind connection. So again, looking at these 5 different aspects and starting from that bottom up approach. So looking at 5 senses, movement, and bodily sensation. So we're gonna briefly discuss 5 different mini practices across 5 different modalities. So I know it seems, even though it's like newer, there are many different body-based approaches. So these are across 5 different approaches that have different lineages, different people who developed them. And we'll group them into 3 aspects: B/refriending your body, reconnecting those neural pathways, which all of this is doing, but specifically looking at those aspects, and then movement and sensations. So in terms of B/refriending your body, knowing that awareness is the first step. And I think that of a lot of things. So it's sometimes we get on ourselves because this outcome isn't happening, but just being aware that it's something that we want to shift something that we can feel, that we can notice and acknowledge, that is already huge. And just being aware of our bodies, remembering that we have a body, and yeah, and that we are somebody and our body does positive things. Our body responded or reacted in certain ways during certain experiences as a way for safety and security. So going back to neuroception and polyvagal theory, it's such an instinctive response. It's not like we're choosing to fight. This is a tongue twister now. It keeps, since it keeps growing, fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, since it's not like we're actively choosing that and it's something so instinctual, we have to acknowledge that in a way, or eventually it's helpful to acknowledge that in a way, our body is responding in that way, even if we didn't want it to. Was our body protecting ourselves? And so our bodies are resilient. So getting a sense to reconnect with our bodies, befriending it, refriending it, is pretty huge. So one way of doing this, looking at integrative restorative yoga nidra for PTSD, there's a concept called body sensing and breath sensing, which kind of sounds like what it is. And there are different exercises to go through in order to increase the sense of body or breath sensing. And one is this idea of thinking about peeling away tension. So this is a little bit different from progressive muscle relaxation in the sense that we aren't increasing tension in our body, but we're drawing awareness to areas of tension as we perhaps starting at the crown of our head and moving through our body to the soles of our feet. So noticing how our body feels, and by noticing it, there will be a softening. So it's like you're not actively trying to change it, yet by noticing, something shifts. By accepting that the body feels as it does, change occurs. And perhaps a way to think about it is through breath. So when someone says, just notice how you're breathing, no need to change it, there's going to be a slight shift in that. And also knowing that breath awareness can be triggering to clients. So that's something. So in terms of examples of how body sensing can be done, there are body scans that people can do. And knowing that body scans can be done in a variety of ways. Like it can focus on different body parts or different energies. In terms of a body scan that's simply for peeling away tension, as it's called, and scanning your body, noticing the tension that might be there and allowing it to soften as you go through. So this can be done with guided meditation or guided practices, which are available through the iRest program but there's a fee for the program. I think it's something you can also look up for free on YouTube and then develop that practice for yourself. And there are scripts, and I think when working with individuals, for me, I personally like to just speak it. And I'll include links to all of these, the programs and everything that's sent. So I'll make sure they're clickable on the PDF. And so with that, so I think in a way it's nice to speak it without the script, because then you're being there with your client or with yourself. Like maybe there are times and spaces in which you want to focus more on a certain area. So, but definitely it's up to your comfort level. It can be something very simple and just you moving through your body yourself. Okay, great questions. Anything else for this part? So then with that, there's an idea of embodying a resource. So resources can be all sort of things. Resources basically, in terms of this context, mean something that helps ground us. So we might feel activated, then we look for a resource that helps us be within our window of tolerance. So these resources can be emotional, somatic, relational, artistic, psychological, nature-based, intellectual, material, or spiritual. Falling into, so in sensory motor therapy, these are some of the like bigger groups of types of resources that you can focus on. Then imagining yourself participating in any of these resources. So let's say yoga helps you feel grounded and within your window. So that would be a somatic resource. And then, so the idea of this is maybe if you're out in an environment in which those safety cues are telling you it's unsafe, then a practice of embodying that resource can be helpful. So it's imagining yourself practicing yoga when you aren't able to in that moment, looking at the images and sights, the sounds, touch, smells, or taste, changes in your posture, your facial expression, your tension, any changes in your impulses to move as you're thinking about practicing this resource. And knowing that when we think about it, kind of like with body sensing, breath sensing, there is going to be a shift, subtle or however, and that hopefully with practice puts us back in our window of tolerance. And the hope for this too is that it's something you can practice before you might feel like you're in a space that's unsafe. So with this, it's practicing it so that when you're in that time in which you need it, it can be readily available to you. And the reason why this works is that we have these mirror neurons. So aside from like, empathy and looking at somebody and how they connect, it's also the sense of when we're imagining something, it's like we are there. We are really conditioning our bodies to be able to pull from that in the future. So I'm wondering, so I had mentioned yoga, maybe that I did an easy selection of a resource there. But what other resources do you all have in mind that could be helpful for you or others, whether they fall in any of these categories, these 11 categories, 9 categories or anything. So for my teens, video gaming, art, music, playing a sport. Oh, houseplants, gardens, tapping. Yes. Going for a walk. Well, I guess I was thinking of somatic experience tapping. So we can talk about that a little bit too, but I don't know if that meant a different kind of tapping. Running hot water or cold water. I think of DBT and tip. So changing some sort of temperature and helping regulate your emotions. Exercising, journaling, dance, taking a shower. Yeah, it can be things that you do every day and just a different intention behind that. Yeah, I'll be curious to hear about others' perceptions on what yoga is. Ooh, circular motion. Then I hear this kind of this contraction expansion part 2 that Carly's talking about that will relate. Hugging a tree, grounding, kind of literally grounding in terms of roots of a tree. Drawing, coloring, yes. So you've seen, yeah, some nature ones, artistic, somatic, intellectual, many of the things. Okay. Thanks for sharing. Ooh, lots of new ones too. Qigong, that's also a body-based thing that we, yeah. Yes. They're putty. I have not heard of that, but that sounds awesome. Squeezing kind of fits into this intense somatic experiencing as well. I notice, yeah, tapping, squeezing. So we can go into that. So pendulation kind of like this idea of a pendulum. So developed by Peter Levine in somatic experiencing therapy. So essentially what happens is that there's a trauma trigger and then we feel activated. And then what we want, and that can kind of just go back and forth without practice. What we want is that activation to bring about that resource, that grounding. So the way that can happen is through pendulation. So we need to, in a way, relive or our body be in that trauma trigger reaction. And then, or the activation, I should say, not totally triggered, but being activated and then bringing in that resource. So what this can look like is focusing on an area of your body in which there is tension. I don't know if you can hear it, but there's something flying overhead. So we're near an Air Force something. So we feel very activated, noticing some sort of area of tension in our body, and then switching, seesawing to an area of our body that isn't as tense. So that might be, it can even be in that same part of your body. So it's like my shoulder feels tense, like right here, but then there's a part of my shoulder back here that doesn't feel as tense. So noticing that and going in and out of that sensation, because kind of like the idea of embodying a resource, we have to practice it in that setting to reset ourselves. So if it's just like only focusing on relaxation, then how will our body know to use this practice when tension arises? So that's pendulation. And I also want to say that Peter Levine is also credited with a lot of containment and boundaries setting. So a way in order to even be aware of our body, to resource it, we have to be aware of our body's boundaries and what we're containing. So some of the ways that he suggests doing this is like, as you all talked about, tapping. So it's being aware of our, literally like being aware of our bodies, where it starts, where it ends, and just feeling the boundary of our body. Giving yourself a hug is one way. And there was squeezing. So literally like squeezing your forearm. It's like, there's my forearm. Being aware, noticing those sensations of change, because sometimes we can feel really numb to it. Any questions about, so thinking of a pendulum, going from activation to resourcing, contracting to expansion, or contracting to relaxing. So like refocusing that area. Any questions on this before we move on to the next part? Fidget spinners. Yeah, that is on a string. That kind of like is like a literal pendulum. Okay. So then some P words, vocabulary. So pendiculation. So it's not simply stretching, because stretching alone is when you're focusing on a muscle in isolation. So like you can think of somebody like putting their leg up at a gym and like reaching to their toes, and that's stretching. Okay, so a question about focusing. So, okay, so I guess the other one was focusing on an area that naturally feels tense, and then focusing on one that in that moment feels relaxed. Whereas pendiculation is a little bit more intentional about that contraction and expansion. So it's a perfect segue into this, and a nice way of comparing, contrasting them. So, I mean, in a way, you're intentionally refocusing your intention, but in terms of that contraction and relaxation, I would say pendiculation is more intentional. So it's not quite stretching like you do it when you're pre or post workout, where you're reaching towards your toes, and whether you hold that for a short amount of time or a long amount of time, it doesn't like shift what's going on. It doesn't shift your baseline contraction, as they call it. So what does help is 3 steps for pandiculation: contracting something, then a slow release to reset, to expand your contraction baseline, and then a complete release. So an example of this is, so animals do this, not just dogs and cats, even though they look really cute, but that they're like, I don't even know what, like tiny little rodent animals that do it and look so cute. So I don't know what you Google to find that. I find it with random pandiculation articles, but I've never tried Googling pandiculation animals. Maybe I will after this. But anyhow, so it's not stretching alone, it's stretching and contracting, stretching and stiffening. So stretching and yawning. So all mammals, humans, have a natural sense of pandiculation. So it comes after a time of tension or a time of stillness, of stiffness, then kind of like this urge to move in some way. So it's kind of, so you're replaying that trauma, that stiffness piece, and then acting on it. So you think about waking up and then you yawn and you stretch. Well, next time somebody calls it stretching, you tell them it's really pandiculation, not stretching. It's like, no, I'm pandiculating, I'm not stretching. So what it is, so you have that contraction phase when you're like this, and then you slowly release your arms, like imagining stretching in the morning and then just letting your arms fall. It feels weird, right? So you have that kind of that slower release, and then a complete release once your arms are by your side. So that's not the slowest release. Like you can have it be very intentionally slow. And the idea, I give that as an example because it's such a natural way for our bodies to pandiculate without us even knowing that's what we were doing. So yeah, there are definitely ways in which you can intentionally have that slow release. But yeah, if you want to try it when you wake up tomorrow morning, contract your hands overhead, and then see if you have any sort of urge to just drop your hands. You're probably not. So that is pandiculation. Okay. So then continuing, we're going to talk about movement and sensations. So any questions before we move on to this section? Okay. And as always, you can put them in the chat. So trauma sensitive yoga. So there was a note that was mentioned earlier about how some clients have a different perception of what yoga is. So calling it stretching or something else is more helpful. So I'm curious to see what other perceptions you or your clients or people in your life have about yoga. So thinking about like standard westernized yoga to yoga studio, what perceptions have you noticed? Oh, poses triggering for some. Yeah, that is a part of trauma sensitive yoga in terms of some of the guidelines. Yeah, I guess, yeah, your body is your family in a way. It holds you. Choices. So already as we're thinking about this, a lot of this aligns with the principles of trauma sensitive yoga. And just acknowledging that when I'm speaking of, yeah, using the word form, exactly. Control and choice. So when I'm speaking of trauma sensitive yoga, I'm really speaking from trauma-centered trauma sensitive yoga, which is a specific form of trauma sensitive yoga that was protocolized by the Trauma Center at Justice Resource Institute in Brookline, Massachusetts, which is now the Center for Trauma and Embodiment. Yes, the Trauma Center was founded by Vanderkolk, as stated, and then TCTSY was developed by the current co-founders of the Center for Trauma and Embodiment. So with that, there are 5+ special considerations that are considered in TCTSY principles. One being the environment in which it is set. So I think somebody said something about hot yoga. So it wouldn't be in that environment. So something, just being aware of that and the space that you're in, like where the door is, if there are windows, whether or not there are mirrors, things, the lighting. So being a little bit more intentional about the environment, about the space that you're sharing yoga in. And then physical forms, yes. So it's rather than calling them poses, preferring to call them physical forms or shapes. Like as was stated, poses can be triggering, and they are also, it's also a reflection of, in a way, something that's static. So when you think like pose, it's something static, whereas these physical forms are very dynamic in terms of how they are. You can really pick anything. So like even naming a pose doesn't really, like, this is the shape of a cat pose, but that can really look like anything. It doesn't have to look like a cat. Who knows what a cat looks like? I mean, I guess we want to be like them when we're pendiculating, but otherwise it's really not a pose per se. It's not a static lens. So referring to them as physical forms, and sometimes I hear shapes, I'm a little cautious of that. A collaborator who, the founder of Yara Yoga, teaches in eating disorder clinics, and the word shape there, people think it means like what shape they're in. So just something to keep in mind depending on your setting also. And then facilitator qualities, what you'd be wearing would be like different from perhaps yoga at a gym. So trying to wear something that's more conspicuous, and yeah, and having a different air in terms of how you're sharing yoga and being aware of those power dynamics too. So it's more like you're facilitating or guiding it and teaching it and telling the participants where they are, because it's their body, they're the expert in their bodies. So really having a different lens in terms of how yoga is taught. Something else that's a special consideration is avoiding hands-on assist. As you can imagine, that can be triggering. And even if you aren't providing a hands-on assistance to somebody, you might be providing to somebody else, someone else can be triggered too with the idea that they might be touched without their consent. And it's also this idea that like we know someone else's body wisdom more than they do, whereas they're listening to their own bodies and what their body needs. So that sense of choice that was mentioned. And then using language of invitation. So in traditional, and by traditional, I mean in typical Western yoga teacher trainings, there's a lot of, it's explicitly called like command-based language or cues, because the idea being like somebody comes in to yoga, we don't want to say that many words. We want to be clear, explicit, and quick in terms of what we're saying. So the cues when you go to one of the more popular yoga studios, like it's like, do this, do that, like lift your knee, like move your arm. Whereas language of invitation is more like, if you'd like to, there's a choice to do this, there's an invitation to do that. So you'll see, these are things that you can notice as Kelsey is guiding us through a practice as well. Okay, and then the 4 themes: experiencing in the present moment, making choices, as we talked about, taking effective action. So this idea that when we make a movement in one sense, like we move our arm, we are also having some sort of action elsewhere in our shoulder, and knowing that we can also shift our bodies in a way that changes our comfort. And then with that, creating rhythms interpersonally with others in the room too, like a sense of community, just being in touch with your body in the present. So knowing that traumas from our past live in our bodies, yet our bodies are in the present, in the here and now. So in summary, these were the 5 that we talked about. Body sensing, getting a sense of our body. 2, embodying a resource. So imagining our body in a grounding technique. 3, pendulation, contraction and expansion, or just like noticing tension and relaxation in our body. Noticing, observing. 4, pendiculation, more intentional contraction, slow release, and then complete release. And then 5, trauma sensitive yoga. So with that, which one will you practice in the near future? We have a poll. Let me launch that. And also keeping it, I meant after the bottom of the hour, because there will be an invitation for trauma sensitive yoga in about 2 minutes. We got something else. You can feel free to write that in the chat if you want to share. I think it is slowing down a little bit. We'll give it a full minute. All right. Body sensing, followed by trauma sensitive yoga, and then the 3 in the middle. Nice. So, any questions before I pass it over to Kelsey? You can definitely email any of us.
Okay. We ready for practice now? I pulled up a timer, so I do have a clock rolling on my computer. I'm going to scoot my chair back away from my desk and where my camera and my screen are. You might want to do something similar. I'm also going to move up here and kind of adjust my camera a little bit. You might want to move where you are in your space. I will be practicing from a chair. You are invited to also practice from a chair. You might know another place you want to practice today. So you might want to sit on the floor, maybe sit somewhere else. You can also do this practice standing if you'd prefer to do the practice standing. And after you've chosen where you want to start, you might take a moment to look around your space. And maybe you're looking around your space. Or maybe you're choosing to keep your attention near the computer. You're invited to watch if that feels useful today. You're also invited to maybe practice motion or movement in your body if that feels accessible. You might take a moment to start to lean your body from one side to the other, possibly noticing where you're connected or where your body is making connections. So whatever type of surface you're sitting or standing on. And as you're ready, you might acknowledge that you have arrived to your practice for today. If you're ready to add motion or other motions, you might start by lifting your chin, maybe looking up. You could stay here. As you're ready, you might start to lower your chin, possibly looking down. You might continue with this lifting and lowering of your chin, maybe lifting, looking up, possibly lowering, looking down. You may choose to move between these places or maybe holding one place for a count or two. Another way to add motion to your spine could be the next time that your head might look up, maybe you also start to lean your upper body forward. So you might be looking up, maybe you're leaning forward. And as you're ready, you could start to lower your chin. Maybe you look down. You might also want to start to round your spine, maybe curling forward. If you like, you could continue between these two places, maybe lifting your chin, possibly leaning forward. And if you like, you might start to lower your chin, maybe curling in. You might round your spine. You could choose how long you hold or maybe pause in one of these places, or maybe you like to create a rhythm moving between looking up or maybe looking down. In your own time, you might end this motion or this form. You could come back to center. And if you like, you might bring your arms out to your sides, maybe bending at your elbows. Your hands might be open or maybe they're closed. And if you like, you could reach your arms up overhead. Maybe your elbows start to straighten. And as you're ready, you might start to bend at your elbows, maybe bringing your hands closer to shoulder height, or maybe you're ready to pull your elbows in. So you might find this motion possibly by lifting your arms up overhead. Maybe your elbows start to straighten. And if you like, when you're ready, you might start to lower your hands, possibly curling your elbows close to you. You might continue with this lifting and lowering motion of your arms for as long as you like. And as you're ready, you might pause this motion or this place, maybe giving your arms a rest. When you're ready, you could start to lean your upper body forward, choosing how far forward you like to lean. And in your own time, you might start to lean your upper body back. Maybe your back makes contact with a chair or a wall, something that might be behind you. In your own time, you could lean your upper body forward. And as you're ready, you might start to lean your upper body back. So your torso could be moving in this rhythm of possibly forward, possibly back. Another way to add motion to your torso could be leaning from one side to the other. So you might change and start to lean your upper body one way. Maybe you pause here. And as you're ready, you could start to lean your upper body, maybe in the opposite direction. So maybe you're creating a rhythm here by leaning your torso one way, maybe leaning in the other. If you like, you could experiment with linking these motions, these torso motions together. So that might look like leaning your upper body forward, possibly leaning to one side, maybe leaning back, perhaps leaning to the other side, and maybe you come forward. So you might be creating kind of a circle motion with your torso. You might be moving in a circle with your torso. You could choose how fast you want these motions to be. If you're choosing to link your motions, you could be choosing to hold one place or maybe pause. And if you are moving in a circle, you might pause in one place and possibly reverse your direction. So you might start to make your circles in the opposite way in which you started. That's a possibility. You could continue moving in the same direction you started in if you wish. You might continue moving your torso in some way, in whatever way feels useful to you, for possibly a count of 3, maybe for 2, perhaps for 1. And whenever you're ready, you might end this motion or those forms, perhaps moving your torso to center. If you like, you might extend your leg out You might extend your leg out. Your heel could be resting to the floor. Maybe your toes are pointed up. You might keep your leg extended, or if you're interested, you could experiment with lifting your leg off the floor. So you may choose how high you lift your leg off the floor. You might hold your leg in space, or maybe you want to find motion by lowering your heel towards the floor, maybe then lifting your leg into space. Whether you're holding or lifting and lowering, you might notice sensation in your leg, possibly your muscles engaging. There's also a possibility you might not notice sensation in this form. Whenever you're ready, you might end this motion, maybe bringing your foot to a resting place. If you're interested in trying this form on the other side, maybe you extend your other leg out. Your heel could be on the floor, maybe your toes are pointed up. If you like, you might keep your leg to the ground. Maybe you're interested in lifting your foot off the floor. You may choose how high you lift your leg off the floor. You could keep your leg in one place, or maybe you want to engage with lifting and lowering your leg. Wherever you are, you might notice sensation in your leg, possibly from your muscles engaging. There's also a possibility you might not notice sensation in this form today. And as you're ready, you might lower your foot, possibly coming to a resting place. If you're interested in finding a twist, you might start to turn your upper body one way. So maybe you turn your upper body one way. You could choose how far you're turning. And in your own time, you might turn your body to center. If you're interested in finding a twist on your other side, maybe you start to turn in the other direction. So you might start to turn, maybe look in the other direction. You may choose how far you're turning here. And in your own time, you might turn your body to center. There's an opportunity here to practice rest. So with rest, my voice will take a pause from speaking for 30 seconds. I do have a timer going on my computer and it's counting the seconds so I can see the timer. So there'll be a 30-second rest opportunity. And in rest, you might choose to find motion. Maybe you want to find some rhythm, possibly by leaning your torso one way or the other. Maybe in rest, you want to practice a form that you have already practiced, or maybe you haven't practiced yet today. Another way to have motion or movement in rest could be opening and closing your hands. So maybe you wanted to open and close your hands during rest. If you prefer not to be in motion during rest, you might find a posture or place where you like to be. So you could stay where you are. Maybe you wanted to move. Maybe you wanted to change where you're sitting or standing, or maybe you wanted to lie down for a moment. Making any adjustments that you might feel that are useful for your rest. Your eyes might be focused on an object in your space, maybe on your screen or your computer. If it feels safe, you might choose to close your eyes for rest. If you do choose to close your eyes, you may also choose to open them at any time for any reason. And I will take a pause from speaking as I keep time for 30 seconds and rest, beginning now. You may choose to close your rest in any way that feels useful to you. One way to close your rest might be finding motion or a new motion, different motion from which you might have been practicing. That could be maybe wiggling your hands, your fingers, maybe adding motion to your feet. You might take a moment to look around your space. Maybe you look around your space. You might have an interest in noticing where you're ending your practice. So that could be by shifting, that could be using your hands, maybe by pressing your hands into the floor, the seat, wherever you might be. And in your own time, in your own way, you might bring your attention to your screen or your computer. And thank you for sharing this virtual practice space today. I'm gonna pull my chair up towards the screen so I can kind of see what's going on in the chat. So much gratitude. Thank you all for your comments and thanks for sharing the virtual practice space. Any reflections or questions that might be coming up for you?
I see one question, Kelsey, that you might be able to answer about if someone feels triggered during the yoga practice, should they just use acceptance? What would you recommend in that event?
Sure. So triggers can definitely come up during the yoga practice, and that's something that it'll be different for everyone. So if acceptance is something that has been useful for you before, maybe that's something that you fall back on. But I would say working with what is kind of your foundation, what works best for you, kind of to fall back on when you're in that moment. And it might be different every time too. Maybe one trigger in a previous practice might come up later in a future practice, and it can be maybe handled or worked with in a variety of ways. So not just one way, as I think we may have explored in the presentation earlier. Very individualized. And it's going to happen. It might happen. So it's not anything that's it's not anything to feel shame around at all. Might be common for others, especially as you start to engage in maybe trauma sensitive yoga for the first time.
I know when it's happened to me, it was important for me to be able to tune into my breath. So I see there's also another question about cueing breath and encouraging breathing. But I know for me, that is something that I always lean on, and being able to have that space and stay in the space. But sometimes your body might be telling you to leave that space too. So I think it is being able to tap into that interoception that we were talking about earlier and using that to guide you. Maybe we'll answer this last question and then we'll close it out. About what language do you use around breathing, reminding or encouraging people to breathe? And I'm assuming this is during a TCTSY session.
Yeah, so great question. And maybe we mentioned this earlier, maybe when you imagine a yoga class or you go to a yoga studio, breathing might be a big part of it. In the TCTSY model, the trauma-centered, trauma-sensitive yoga, which is the practice that I just shared, there are no cues or focusing specifically on breath. It's mostly about body sensations and movement, a lot of creating rhythms with your body, you're moving. You can do that with breath. But the emphasis is not on the breath. So some ways, and I don't think I did it in this practice today, but a cue that could be used would be something like, let's say you're in a form and the facilitator might say, you might notice your breath in this form. And so it's saying, you might bring awareness to your breathing. There's no telling someone how to breathe or to take a deep breath. That is not included in this model, but there is cool research about the impacts of breathing and different breathing exercises. So that might be a technique that's useful for you, or maybe you hear of that in other contexts. Good question.
Well, thank you so much, Kelsey. Thank you, Vian, and thank you to our interpreters. Again, I sent some links in the chat as well too to fill out our post-webinar survey just to share some thoughts about what you learned, maybe some suggestions or recommendations for future events, anything that you would like Vian and Kelsey to know, any questions that you may still have, feel free to share that. And then I also sent instructions for how to request a certificate of attendance, which will be sent out in the next few days. And then we will also receive an email again with the link to the recording as well as the PowerPoint slides. So I hope you all have a great rest of your Tuesday. Thank you so much for spending the last 90 minutes with us, and hope to have you at future events. Speaking of, we do have a yoga practice. It's not through TCTSY, but it is a different form of being trauma informed called Total Resilience Yoga, or TRI. And so that's actually going to be on Saturday, Juneteenth. It's free, and that will be recorded as well. So I put the registration link in the chat, and then we'll have another yoga event as well later on this month, and then another webinar on the power of saying no and how to say it. So I'll add the link in the chat as well too. So hope to have you at those future events. Thank you again. Now go ahead and stop the recording.